Lekutei Sicha is Chelek Chav Daled, Vayelech Sicha Aleph, Lilu Nishmas of Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Nasha Kaltman. We are also learning Le'uschus Yosef Shlema ben Risha for a Refuah Shlema Ukreiva. The Sicha is an absolutely beautiful, fascinating Sicha with two parts. First part will be a Rashi Sicha, Hesber on a Rashi, and again we will see what Rashi is teaching us and how it fits so perfectly into the words of Rashi, that there's no other way to really understand Rashi other than this way. And the second part of the Sikha, a fascinating connection between all of the aspects of Shemita and Hakhel. Even though technically they're two totally separate mitzvahs, they just happen to be, as if to say, happen to be adjacent in time, but in truth, they are deeply and intrinsically connected, as we will see. Sif Aleph. In the Mitzivoy of Mrs. Hakhel is the Aschala, Mikate Sheva Shonim b'Meish Nasa Shmita b'Chag HaSukkos. This week's Parsha, Parshat Vayelech, talks about the mitzvah of Hakhel, which was a gathering that all the Yidden, men, women, and children would gather in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Sukkos, after Shmita. The way the pasuk introduces it is at the end of 7 years, in the time of the year of Shmita, on the Yom Tov of Sukkot. So Rashi Maitik from pasuk Diverter Mikate Sheva Shonim. So Rashi quotes these words Mikate Sheva Shonim and is mefarish and explains B'Shana Rishona Shal Shmita. This is the first year of the Shmita, of the cycle of 7 years of Shmita. It's year 1, Shehishana Shminis, which is the 8th year, if you're counting from the previous Shemitah cycle. So then why is it being called Shemitah if it's the first year or the 8th year, but it's certainly not the 7th year? Because some of the parts of Shvius are still observed. For example, those things that have to be harvested that grew in the year of Shvius, at least a third of the growth, and now it finishes the growth in the year after Shvius, you still have to observe the laws of Shemitah and not take it from the field. So since there are some parts of Shemitah that are still being observed in the 8th year, therefore the pasuk calls it b'moed shnasa Shemitah. So on a very basic, superficial level, is the Shaila was Rashi kumferen, and what's bothering Rashi? Loshna Kosov is Mikate Sheva Shonim. There's Safun Dizi Ben Yor. Loshna Kosov implies that it's at the end of the 7th year. Fundem Zibit Yor, which would be in the 7th year. It's at the end of the 7 years, meaning to say, as the 7th year comes to a conclusion. When Azayzech moving from Lashon b'Moed Shnasa Shmita, also from the fact that it says in the time of the Shmita year, implies as das is the Yar for Shmita, that we're in the year of Shmita. Und danach is the pasuk Messiah, but then at the end of the pasuk it says b'Chag HaSukkos. Was is nit in soif von siebten Jahr. Sukkos is not the end of the 7th year. So if the beginning of the pasuk implies that we're in the 7th year, but at the end of the 7th year, Mikate Sheva Shonim, and then he says B'Chag HaSukkos, which is at the beginning of the year, is Rashi Mefaris. Therefore Rashi comes to say, as Mikate Sheva Shonim da main Shana Rishona Shel Shmita Sheishana Shminis, that we're not talking about the 7th year, we're talking about the 8th year or the first year of the new cycle. Thus Hayes says Mikate's main tak is soif, that the word Mikate does mean, as we thought it does, it means the end. V'Rashi ties Bereis Parshas Mikates, Colossian Kates, Seifu, as Rashi told us in Parshas Mikates, which its name is Mikates. Says Rashi that whenever it uses the term Kates, it means the end of something. Aber es meint noch in Sof. Here it means after the end of the 7th year. Noch dem wie se endig in sich sein Rishonim, after the 7 years are completed. Sheishana Shminis, which means we're already in the 8th year, and therefore it's a Chag HaSukkos. It's in the Sukkos of the 8th year. Wie bald aber als von dem Hemshech HaKosov b'Meish Nasa Shmita is mashma, das meint in Nasa Shmita. However, the pasuk continues that this is in the year of Shmita, implying that it's in Shmita, not in the year after Shmita. Is Rashi Mamshech v'lam okeir Eish Nasa Shmita. So Rashi explains why does the pasuk call it Shmita? And Rashi answers because Shvius is still being observed to some degree in the 8th year. So seemingly what's bothering Rashi is the contradiction between Mikate Sheva Shonim, which is implying that it's the end of the 7th year, and Chag HaSukkos, which is the beginning of the year. And therefore Rashi tells us that it means in the 8th year. It's at the end of, meaning after the conclusion of the 7 years. But this understanding of Rashi raises two questions. Alle Rashi gedarft meitig sein euch die Wörter bechag Sukkos. Oder akol panem ze mirame sein mit v'gomer. Rashi should have quoted from the pasuk the words bechag Sukkos, or at least added the word v'gomer, etc., to allude to the words b'chag Sukkos, because they are the issue here. The whole thing that's bothering Rashi, according to this understanding, is that it says miketz and it says b'chag Sukkos, which seems to contradict miketz. It's with the words b'chag Sukkos that raise the question on the pasuk. So if what's bothering Rashi is the words miketz and b'chag Sukkos, Rashi should have included or at least alluded to the words b'chag Sukkos. Base, the second question. If Rashi's intent is to tell us that we are talking about after the 7 years, not as we might have learned it more simply, that it means in the end of the 7th year, still within the 7th year. So all Rashi has to tell us is that Miketz Sheva Shanim means the 8th year. Why does Rashi have to say that it's the first year of the new cycle? The whole thing he's trying to tell us is that Miketz means after the 7th year, not in the 7th year, after the 7th year. So he says, in the 8th year. Why does he have to add that it's the first year of the new Shemita? Which doesn't in any way translate Miketz. Miketz means the end. So you're telling me that it's the 8th year, the end of after the 7 years. Fine. But to say that it's the first year of the new Shemita doesn't translate the word Miketz. And seemingly adds nothing to our understanding of the pasuk. So our first question is, why does Rashi not quote b'chag Sukkos in the Dibur HaMaschil? Our second question is, why does Rashi say the words Shana Rishayna Shel Shmita and not suffice with just telling us that Miketz Sheva Shana means the 8th year? As we find in the Mishnah and the Gemara, as Meruftim is man for Hakhel, Bishmini or Bishminis, that the time of Hakhel is referred to as the 8th year, as Vert aber nit gesagt after das ist Shana Rishayna Shel Shmita, but nowhere do we find the Shmita year referred to as the first year. It's referred to often as the 8th year because it's the year after the 7th year. So in Siv Beis, the Rabbi is going to say that maybe we misunderstood Rashi. Maybe Rashi is bothered by something else and telling us something entirely different in the words that Rashi is telling us. Seemingly we can answer the second question by asking, why does Rashi add the words B'shana Rishayna Shel Shmita? As Rashi kommt to mechades an under pirush, sai in Miketz, sai in Sheva Shanim. The Rashi is introducing a brand new interpretation of the word Miketz and of the word Sheva Shanim. You can learn in a pasuk, and by that Rashi is negating another way of understanding the pasuk that one might have thought to learn. In other words, we're going to see a different pirush in Rashi. One might think to say Miketz pirush soif und das meint im ganzen 7. Jahr. That the word Miketz means the end. So if it's the end of the 7-year cycle, then the entire 7th year is considered Miketz. Is that Miketz from the Tkuf of the 7th year is the conclusion of the 7-year cycle. And therefore we would say, what does the pasuk mean? As zum Sof von Zibiyar Tkufa, at the end of the 7-year cycle, Hainu der ganze Zibiyar, which refers to the entire 7th year, was is Moit Nasa Shmita, which is the time of Shmita, so that fits in very nicely into the pasuk. In dem Zman von Chag HaSukkos von 7 Jahren soll sein Hakhel, and the Hakhel is in the Sukkos of the 7th year. Let's see how we learn in the pasuk. Miketz Sheva Shanim, in the end of the cycle of the 7 years, which means in the 7th year, which is the year of Shmita, in the Sukkos of that year, meaning the Sukkos of the 7th year, you should observe Hakhel. So a person might have thought that the meaning of the pasuk is that Hakhel is in the Sukkos of the 7th year. Is Rashi Shelel Das, and therefore Rashi comes to negate that understanding of the pasuk. Umefarish, Rashi explains, Miketz Sheva Shanim does ayetzim min haklal. That over here the word Miketz Sheva Shanim is an exception to the rule. Da meites nit soif nor haschala. Here Miketz doesn't mean the end, it means the beginning. In one of the Ha'aris, the Ha'ara 14, The Rebbe points out that the word kates or kitsei, even though we say in English the end, but for example, a stick has two ends, or a rope has two ends. One would be the beginning, one would be the end. In English, we call it the ends. A stick has two ends. But really, the stick has a top and a bottom, or a beginning and an end. So the word kates or kitsei could mean one kitsei is the beginning, the other kitsei is the end. We could say from one end of the world to the other, which is, we call it, in English we use both words end, but it means from the beginning of the world to the end of the world. So therefore, we would say that over here, Mikate Sheva Shanim means the beginning of the 7 years. As we find the Parshas Mikates, that some of the Mefarshim, some of the commentaries there, say that the word Mikates could mean the beginning. So what Rashi, so Rashi is telling us, when he says the words in Rashi, Shana Rishayna Shel Shmita, that the word Mikates means the beginning of the 7th year. That Anfang von 7 Jahre boys, that when do you do Hakhel? In the beginning of the new 7-year cycle. That would answer why Rashi says the words Shana Rishayna Shel Shmita, because he wants to emphasize that Mikates means the beginning, and we're doing Hakhel at the beginning of the new cycle. Lefize is aber nicht verstandig liidach. But if that's the pshat in Rashi, then we don't understand in the other way. Was Rashi is meisiv sheishana shminis. Why does Rashi add the words that it's the 8th year? These are hemshech from the Friedrich Shmita, that it's a continuation of the previous Shmita. If the whole word of Rashi is that it's the beginning of a new Shmita, beginning of a new Shmita cycle, then why did Rashi go right away and say after that it's the 8th year? It's not the 8th year, it's the 1st year. Void v'ikr. But there's an even more pressing question on this second interpretation of Rashi. If Rashi is introducing the meaning of the words, a new meaning to the words Miketz Shevashanim, different than it normally is in other places. First of all, Rashi has to introduce it as something novel. As is nit wieder klar, was allein sagt Kalash and Kate Seifu, that this is different than the rule that Rashi himself brought earlier in Parshas Miketz, that whenever you use the term Kates, it means an end as a conclusion. And Rashi should have also brought some proof that Miketz could mean a beginning. Beis, es hat gedarstehen als Teich von die Wörter Miketz Shavashanim. It should have been written as a translation, which means it would say Miketz Shavashanim, Shadna Rishayna Shel Shmita, the 1st year of the Shmita. From Lashon Rashi, Bishana Rishayna Shel Shmita, Rashi adding the letter Beis, meaning it's saying in the 7th year, is Mashma, as Niter kommt uptight in the word Miketz Shavashanim. That Rashi is not translating the word Miketz that it means in the beginning of the 7th year. Nor Zogin Mefared Zain, in welchem Zman das is. Rashi is elucidating. Rashi is defining when the time is. Bishana Rishayna Shel Shmita, Sheishana Shminis, it's in the 1st year of Shmita, which is the 8th year, if you're counting the previous Shmita. The way Rashi structures it, it seems to be more of a description than a translation. And if the whole word of Rashi is that Miketz means the beginning of the Shmita, then Shana Rishayna is a translation. It should have been written as a translation, not as a description. So now we have a general question, which this question applies both on Sif Aleph, when we touched over there, that the Chiddush of Rashi is that Chag HaSukkos of the 8th year, it says Miketz Shavashanim, which sounds like it's in the 7th year, then it says Chag HaSukkos. So Rashi tells us that it's in the 8th year, and then we asked, why does it say Shana Rishayna Shel Shmita? Whether you say the second shot that Rashi holds that Miketz means in the beginning, and then we asked, in that case, why does it say Shehish Bishminis? What's the lashon? I lost the place. Shehi Shana Shminis, that it's the 8th year. Now we have another question that on the end of Rashi that is applicable to both suggestions that we had in Rashi. Was ist don Negea, das ist Meitz Nasa Shmita? Why is it relevant that it is the season, it is the time of Shmita? That even in the 8th year, you still have to observe Shvius with regards to some of the things that grew in the Shvius year and are still growing into the 8th year. The fact that it's prohibited to harvest that grain, we already know this. From Frier Bepirish Rashi, if Bechadish Bekatzer Tishbes, on a pasuk in Parshas Kisisa where it says you shall. This actually a pasuk is talking about Shabbos, and the pasuk ends. You should rest from plowing and from harvesting. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, why does the pasuk single out Chadash and Katzer? You have to rest from all malacha on Shabbos. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, according to one opinion, says that it's talking about these words are referring to Shvius, not Shabbos, but Shemita. And you're supposed to be Moisif Michayla Lakodesh like you do on Shabbos. You're supposed to extend the Shvius from in the beginning and the end. And therefore, even before Shvius, you stop to plow. And even after Shvius, you don't harvest. So the din that Shvius is noyig even into the 8th year, I already know. So Rashi is not telling it to us, and the pasuk is not telling us to know the din. So why does it have to tell it to us here? And regardless, this pasuk is discussing the laws of Hakhel. So it doesn't seem fitting, doesn't seem to be in the right place to teach us laws of Shvita, of Shvius. As that even in the 8th year, you still have to observe certain dinim of Shvius. So, we're trying to understand the Rashi. We don't understand why Rashi says B'shana Rishona Shel Shmita. If the whole Rashi is trying to tell us that it's in the 8th year, Mikate Sheva Shana means in the 8th year. If Rashi is telling us that it means the first year of the Shemitah, Miketz means the beginning, then why does Rashi say the word Bishminis? And whether you say this or the other, why does Rashi have to add the fact that during the 8th year, there are still some of the laws of Shemitah that are applicable? The Rebbe is now going to introduce a biur, which is very different than what we've said until here, but every single detail of Rashi is going to fit in perfectly. First of all, the Rebbe says, Rashi darf nicht befahren sein dem Teich von Miketz. Rashi does not have to tell us the Teich of Miketz. Like in the first Pirush, he was explaining the Teich. Rashi does not have to tell us what the word Miketz means, because Rashi already told this to us in Parshas Miketz. As Kolosh and Ketz Seifu, that whenever it says the word Ketz, it means the end. Meila Muvan is B'chol Mokim is Pirushi V'darten by V'hi Miketz, and for now we understand that applies to every time whenever it says the word Miketz, and as Eich Da is the Pirush La'acharei de Shevashanim, and just like in Miketz, it means after the 2 years. Yosef was in jail for 10 years, and then the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ephraim left the jail, and then Yosef sat in jail for another 2 years. Was after the 2 years of jail. And so too over here, when it says Miketz, it means after the 7 years of Shemita. So there's Bechlal not a kasha. Rashi doesn't have a question why it's on Sukkot, which is the beginning of the year. Because we already know from Miketz that Miketz means after the end of the 7 years. So in that case, what's bothering Rashi? Rashi kumta b'mevar zayin da shayla klolis and there's one from Mitzvah. Rashi instead is not coming to answer certain words in this pasuk. Rashi is coming to respond to a general question with regards to the timing of the mitzvah of Hakhel. As the Rebbe says, as I discussed many times, as b'chomakim for Rashi and Inyan Klali, b'kama mekaymis for Rashi and Inyan Klali in the parsha Glak B'tchilas Inyan. There's many places where Rashi addresses an issue at the very, very beginning of the topic. Even though the question won't really arise until a few other psukim, later psukim are introduced. Das is deep psukim from their parsha, but nevertheless, because they're in this parsha, and this discussion is going to be a general idea that is relevant to all of the psukim. In other words, usually Rashi is going to address the question when it arises. So if there's a certain pasuk and there's a stira between this pasuk and another pasuk, Rashi will wait till the second pasuk to teach us, to point out the issue and to explain it to us. But if it's a general idea that's relevant to all of the psukim, Rashi will right away in the beginning introduce this issue and explain it to us. So therefore, there's an inyan klali, there's a general idea in relation to the timing of Hakhel that has to be addressed, and Rashi addresses it right away in this Rashi. Uba haktim, what is this issue? So the Rebbe is going to say now that many mitzvahs, Hashem, or the Torah, gives us the reason why to keep them. Even on the very basic level of pshat, you will see that throughout the mitzvahs, there are certain mitzvahs that have a reason. Certain mitzvahs, such as the chukim, the statutes, do not have a reason that was given to us. And amongst the mitzvahs that do have a reason, whether the Torah explicitly tells us their reason, or the time is moving or the reason of this mitzvah is self-understood. There are certain mitzvahs that even the details of the mitzvah have a reason. And certain mitzvahs that although the mitzvah in general, we're told why to keep this mitzvah, nevertheless within the mitzvah there are various details that we don't know the reason for them. So the idea that a mitzvah has a reason, and the idea that even the pratei mitzvah have a reason, is going to be applicable only by certain mitzvahs. But mitzvahs Hakhel. And mitzvahs Hakhel is an example of that. Is mefurish b'pasuk the tam mechuvan mitzvah. The pasuk tells us clearly the reason and the intent of the mitzvah. Leman yishmu, leman yilbudu v'yaros Hashem, so that they should listen, they should hear the words of the king, they should learn, and they should fear Hashem. When also some of the details that Torah tells us are also understood. One of the things is that the timing was done that all the Yidden will have come to see the countenance of Hashem in the place that Hashem has chosen. Because Yidden were anyway coming to be Oile Regel, so therefore it was an easier time to gather all the Yidden. Also the place that Hashem chose is mermasim, is more fitting of peilin to effect Leman Yishmu, Leman Yilmud of Yaru, because it's a holy place. It's a place where they connect with Hashem. So therefore it's a place where they can get inspired to hear, to learn the words of the king, and to fear Hashem. So Hakhel is a reason. Hakhel is a mitzvah that the reason was given to us, and even some of the details have the reason. But if this is the case, this requires an explanation. Where the Torah says that the right time to do Hakhel is at the end of the 7 years. And here's the question. If you want to inspire someone to do something, if you want to inspire someone to be God-fearing, which is the intent of the mitzvah of Hakhel, it shouldn't be done at the end of a time period. You want to inspire someone that they should do things with Yiras Hashem. When is the best time to inspire them? When they're about to embark on the journey. When they're about to begin a new time period. So the Rashi is bothered. Why are we saying Miketz? That's why the Dibra Masal is only Miketz Shevashanim, not B'chag HaSukkos. Because Miketz Shevashanim, Rashi is saying 1 second. If the whole purpose of Hakhel, as we're going to see in the later Psukim, L'man Yishmu, L'man Yilmudu, V'yaru Es Hashem, is in order to inspire the Yidden, why are we inspiring them at the end of the 7 years and not at the beginning of the 7 years? Why does Rashi say Miketz? Why does the Pasuk say Miketz? Is Rashi mefarish, and therefore Rashi comes to say as enochinami. The Rashi, the first thing he says is it is the first year of the new Shemita cycle. You're right. An inspiration, the best time for inspiration is at the beginning of a journey or at the beginning of a specific time, and that's why Hakhel was in the beginning of the new Shemita. But that doesn't answer the question why the pasuk says Miketz. Rashi was bothered. Why are you saying Miketz? It's at the end of the 7 years. If it should be at the beginning, so Rashi says, yeah, it's back at the beginning. So then why does the pasuk say Miketz? But das kommt als which implies that it's coming at the end. And and it's coming as a follow-up to the last 7 years. That's why Rashi adds that it's the 8th year. Yes, you're right that for the inspiration, we need to be in the beginning of the new Shmita, in the beginning of the new cycle. But we also, as we're going to explain in a moment, we also need to be at the end of the previous cycle, after last Shmita. in order to properly succeed in the goal, in the intent of Hakhel, you have to be in the beginning of the new cycle to be able to inspire them for the new cycle, but you also need to be at the end, in the 8th year, in the year after Shemita, as the Rebbe will explain in Siftat. There's Barabaza. Shmita. It's the year of Shemita is a year when it is a sabbatical for the land. So you don't sow the field, you don't prune the vineyard, you don't harvest the younger growths, and you don't cut down the young grapes. In other words, you're not doing any agricultural work. Even on the most basic level, it's understood as demult that at that time, because they are free from working the land, which was their primary occupation. Yidden had more time, and therefore they primarily devoted themselves to learning Torah. So the learning of Torah led to fear of Hashem and doing mitzvahs. So the year of Shemita is not just a sabbatical year, meaning to say a year of no agricultural work. The year of Shemita is also a year where the Yidden have the ability to devote themselves to their own spiritual growth, to learning Torah and Yiras Hashem and doing mitzvahs. Valpizes move on the Mekasher zwischen Mrs. Hakhel, was is Bishon Rishon Shel Shemita und Shnas Shemita Shel Lifnei. And now we understand the connection between the mitzvah of Hakhel, which is happening in the first year of the new Shemita cycle, and it's connected to the year of Shemita that precedes it. When you have to begin a new cycle of 6 years, during which you're plowing your field and you're pruning your vineyard, in the Ersten Jahr von Shemita, it's the first year, you need a special inspiration. That should impact the next 6 years. As even while they're involved in the worldly matters, in working the land, they should fear Hashem. And they should observe all of the words of the Torah. So that's why we're doing it in the first year, because we were trying to inspire them that they should be able to carry on this Yiras Hashem, etc., throughout the 6 years. And how does one get this inspiration? Obviously through the king saying it by Hakhel. But how does it work? How does the king's words inspire the people? Because he remembers the Shemita year that just passed. When he was devoted to learning Torah, and absorbed the fear of Hashem, the Teichev mitzvahs Hakhel is to fortsetzen. So now it means that the year of Hakhel is to continue, to carry on, und starken, and to intensify the Yisraelis from the Shemita year, the inspiration of the Shemita year, that it should carry over into the following 6 years. When we're busy when we're occupied, with working the land. And that's what Rashi is indicating when he says it's the 8th year. The erste von die 6 Jahr, darf sein nicht blaze as Hakhel von der neue Shemita schon der Shemita Shel Shemita. This year that we're doing Hakhel in, which is the first of the next 6 years, it's not just the beginning of the new 6 years. Nor euch it's also a continuation to the previous year. This is an 8. Jahr was kommt nach der Shana Shvis. It's an 8th year that is coming after the Shemita year, the sabbatical year that was just observed. So Rashi is telling us that we need both. On the one hand, you're right that inspiration has to be at the beginning. So therefore, when do we do Hakhel? At the beginning of the new cycle. But it has to be juxtaposed to a Hakhel year. To a Shemita year. Because it's during the Shemita year that a Yid is pursuing his own spiritual growth, and he's learning Torah and he's doing mitzvahs, and now he takes that energy and he carries it over into the year of Hakhel to inspire and to inject a Yiras Hashem and a connection with Hashem into the following 6 years. So that's why Rashi says both. B'shana Rishona Shel Shemita and B'shminis. What about the end of Rashi? where Rashi says, why is it called Shemita? Because some of the laws of Shemita are still applicable in the 8th year. Now we understand. Because since the whole concept of Hakhel is specifically done not just in the beginning of the new cycle, but right after Shemita, then it intensifies our point when we see that Shemita continues into the 8th year. But we'll understand why he refers to it as Shnas HaShmita. And as Rashi explained, because Shvius, some of the laws of Shvius are still applicable. Which earlier we asked the question, why is the pasuk that's talking about Hakhel telling us laws of Shvius? So now it's understood. Because it's not just the fact that Shemita just passed is not just a parenthetical indication to know which year we're talking about. But there's no connection in the theme of Shemita and Hakhel, what you might have thought. No. As we now understand that the two are connected to one another. So forsetzen these editors from the Friedrich Shmita Yar, in order to carry on the inspiration of the previous Shmita year, is a pasuk madgish. The pasuk emphasizes as Eich der Achter Yar is Shnas HaShmita, that also the 8th year is also considered a year of Shmita. But because of some of the laws of Shvius that are still applicable, nicht nur is in der Aschala von Shana Rishena Shal Shmita da der Zikaron und die Yisraelis und the Friedrich Shmita Yar. So when this new year begins, not only do we have a memory, are we remembering the previous Shmita year, we actually have some of the parts of Shmita itself in the Mekatzah Shal Shvius, it's the Moshe Shvius, for those things that grew in the Shvius year that have to be harvested in the 8th year. And since they can't be totally involved in working the field, they have more time, more free time to learn Torah. So the Shemitah year, not only is it being remembered in the 8th year, it's actually continuing and being observed in the 8th year. And therefore it's a perfect time for the king to get up and inspire the Olam who are already pre-inspired from the Shemitah year and are continue to be inspired because of the fact that Shemitah is still going on in a certain sense. And with that, he can now inspire them to take this attitude and this inspiration into the next 6 years. And this is the Rashi. And now we see that every part of Rashi is so perfect and so precise. What was bothering Rashi was, why would we do an act of inspiration at the end of an era? And Rashi says, no, it's at the beginning of an era. But the pasuk calls it Miketz, because though it's the beginning of a new cycle, it's purposely done right after the end of the previous cycle, where the people are still inspired by the Shemitah year. And Rashi even adds that's not just Shemitah was in the past year, Shemitah continues into this year. Shemitah doesn't end with the end of the 7th year. In Siv Vav, the Rabbi is going to address a halachic relevance that can be taken from this idea, from the fact that we say that Hakhel has to come after Shemitah. It actually has a nafkamina lahalacha, a halachic relevance. From some of the incredible ideas that are in the realm of halacha that can be deduced from this Rashi. The fact that we know that the pasuk says that Hakhel should be at the end of the 7 years in the time of Shemitah. Adas is the yard nach Shemitah, that it's the year after Shemitah. Kemen Klaren, Tzidas is blaze asimin and velchiyam and abakayim and mitzvahs Hakhel. The bishminis is the fact that the pasuk is telling us that Hakhel is in the year after Shemitah. Is it just like an indication, a sign? Like, how do I know when to figure out when it's Hakhel? Just know whenever Shemitah is, Hakhel is the next year. In the Yar Noch Shmita. Others is totally in the Kif Mitzvah Shmita. Or the mitzvah of Hakhel is dependent on the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Shmita. That if for some reason the Shmita wasn't fulfilled, then Hakhel wouldn't apply. What would be the relevance in actuality? It would be during the second Beis Hamikdash. There were certain opinions that during the second Beis Hamikdash, Shmita was only an obligation midrabanan. Minat Torah, Shmita was not an obligation. So now we have a situation that you don't have to do Shmita minat Torah. So now let's go back to the previous debate whether Shemita is a sign or Shemita is actually necessary in order to launch Hakhel. According to the first svara, that the Shemita year is just a sign to know when to do Hakhel. It's obvious that even in the second Beis Hamikdash, even though there was no chiyuv menatera to do Shemita, but nevertheless they knew when Shemita was, and never they knew when Hakhel was. Like the zweite svara, but according to the second opinion, that Hakhel is dependent on the fulfillment of Shemita, then in the year in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, when they were not mechuyev to do Shemita menatera, they wouldn't be mechuyev to do Hakhel either. So which one is it? What would be the halacha? Is Shemita a siman, or is Shemita necessary to be fulfilled in order to launch Hakhel? But according to the way we explain the words of Rashi, especially the end of Rashi, why is it being called Shemita? That Shvius is still being observed in this year. As das is a hemshich von dem Kiyum mitzvah Shmita b'shana Shvius, which makes it clear that Hakhel is being done in the year that is a continuation to the fulfillment of Shmita in the 7th year. Kumtuis, as mitzvahs Hakhel is tolu in dem Kiyum mitzvah Shmita b'shana Torah. That would imply that Rashi holds that according to halacha, Hakhel is dependent on Shmita, and therefore in the second Beis Hamikdash, for example, when they didn't fulfill Shmita, they wouldn't be. They didn't have to fulfill Shmita Minat Torah. There wouldn't be a mitzvah of Hakhel either Minat Torah. The Rebbe in the brackets refutes this. In other words, on a more straightforward level, you say that obviously Rashi is connecting Shmita and Hakhel, and therefore it's not just a siman. It's actually necessary to do Hakhel, to do Shmita, in order for Hakhel to be obligated. Says the Rebbe that nevertheless this is not absolute. It's not certain. You could respond to say that as long as Shmita is being observed in the 7th year, even if it's just midirabanan, since at the end of the day they are actually taking a break from working the land. The whole point really wasn't so much that Shmita is being observed, but the fact that a person has time to learn Torah and do mitzvahs, and engage in Yiras Shamayim. So it's possible you could argue back and say that as long as the inspiration is there, because they're fulfilling the mitzvah, they're fulfilling the rules, even if it's not a chiyuv, if it's not an obligation. But once you have the inspiration, because they're learning Torah and doing Yiras Shamayim, because they're not working the land, so then you could say that it's still called Hakhel Minat Torah, and they would then be obligated to mitzvah Hakhel. As we find, for example, that if a person makes a kinyan on something, let's say, even if the type of kinyan was introduced by the Rabbanon, nevertheless, the ownership that the person has can help him for things Minat Torah. For example, a person makes a marriage. So he makes a kinyan. A kinyan agav is a kinyan with the Rabbanon. But nevertheless, he's married Minat Torah. So the kinyan is midrabanan. So too, even though the Shmita is midrabanan, but nevertheless, once it's being done properly, it could still help that Hakhel should be Minat Torah. So that's the Rebbe's refutation to his suggestion that you could take a halachic limud from this Rashi. Okay, asked and answered. In Sif Zayin, the Rebbe is going to go a little bit into Pnimisa Inyanim, into more of a deeper dimension of the mitzvah of Shmita and Hakhel. The Rebbe is going to ask where, if Shmita is affecting Hakhel, where in Hakhel do you see Shvisas Ha'aretz? Do you see the fact that the land is resting? You see the fact that the person is getting inspired, is pursuing a spiritual life. And this is going to lead into a whole discussion about the various aspects of Shmita and how we see them in the mitzvah of Hakhel. The theme of Shemita, as it is written clearly in Torah, is nit das was Eden done b'meshach dem yar. Is not just the fact that Yidden, who during the year will have extra time because they're not working the land, will be able to learn more Torah. It's a sabbatical for the land, for the ground, for the soil. You shouldn't you shouldn't plant the field, you shouldn't prune the vineyard. And this has an effect on the next 6 years. When you can work with the field and the vineyard, because through fulfilling the mitzvah of Shemita, a Yid knows and a Yid actually displays as ein davar meyuchad b'rishusei. He doesn't have anything specifically in his own possession. Everything he has is in the domain of the master of everything. As an Eibishter, the balabas of sein Sode, und if alt was is doing Welt, the Eibishter is the owner of his field and the owner of everything that's in the world. As it is explained at length in those who explain the reasons of the mitzvahs, that the reason of Shemita is to proclaim the fact that I don't own my land, the Eibishter owns my land. And therefore, when he goes ahead in the 6 years that it is permissible to do so, and he plants and he prunes and he does everything that he's supposed to do in the field, it's done behesem zum Ratzon Hashem. It's done consistent with Hashem's will. The Ratzon from the Balabas from the Welt, who is the owner of the world, and therefore everything we do should be according to his will. So that is the ultimate underlying theme of Shemita, that the person should not work the land and thus recognize that he doesn't own his field. The field belongs to Hashem, the world belongs to Hashem. And since the Torah is emphasizing that Hakhel is in the era, in the time of Shemita, as we said earlier, that Hakhel is a continuation from the inspiration of the Shemita year, as it carries over into the 8th year. We must say that this inspiration, that the Eibishter is the owner of the world, continues into the next 6 years through the inspiration of Hakhel. Where in Hakhel do we see any form of inspiration that the Eibishter is the boss of the world? That's the question. In other words, the fact that a person is growing in his ruchnias, that we see in Hakhel, that we see in Shemita, that we see that Hakhel will inspire, and that'll inspire the next 6 years. But what about this other part of Shemita? The fact that it's supposed to awaken within the Yid the recognition that the Eivus is the balabais of the world, the owner of the world. Where is that seen in Hakhel? We're going to answer this question by saying that it is connected with the Parshias in the Torah, which the king reads at the Hakhel ceremony. As the Mishnah lists, from the beginning of Chumash Dvarim until the part of Shema, which is in Vayeschanon, Ushma, then the parsha of Shema, which is in Parshas Ekev, Aser to Aser, Kisachala Laser. There are two separate parshas, which are Asa to Aser in Parshas Re'eh, and Kisachala Laser in Parshas Kisavei, Brachas Uklolis, which is also in Parshas Kisavei, and Parshas Amelech Hasima Alei Melech, which is in Parshas Nitzavim or Vayelech. So the Rebbe is answering the question that in the parshas that the king reads, we will see the inspiration of the Shemitah year, that the Eibush is the Balabais of the world. You will see that in these parshas. The Bir Bazeh. And to explain this, the Rebbe goes back a little bit and dissects a little bit more the mitzvah of Shemitah and the various elements that make up the Shemitah year. The mitzvah of Shemitah. Mitzvah Shemitah, Tiltzach, Bechlolos, and Derayin Yon, and the mitzvah of Shemitah is divided into 3 elements. Aleph, number 1, Shvisas HaAdam, the fact that the person is resting. The prohibition upon the person to engage in agricultural work. Instead, he should devote himself to learning Torah. So that's step number 1, the person. Element number 1. Element number 2, Beis, Shvisas HaAretz. The earth, the land has to to take a break. The earth then ceases from all types of work. As during the year of Shemita, no agricultural work is done. By the earth itself, there is a concept of it being a sabbatical year. Gimel, the third element, is the paydas was Shmita. The fruits that grow during the Shmita year, said in Hakhel, they're ownerless, and anybody can take them. The owner of the field can't take them as if it's his own possession. So these are the three elements of Shmita: the person, the field, the earth, and the fruit. Now, the general intent, the primary goal of Shmita is canal, as mentioned previously, to show that everything is in the domain, in the ownership of Hashem, the master of everything. And therefore we must say that in each of these three details, these elements, we're going to see another aspect of Hashem's ownership, as will be explained in Sif Tes. Really, really beautiful, beautiful stuff. As you'll see, the Eibishter's balabatishkeit on every aspect of the person. The fact that the person is not allowed to work during the Shemitah year, this shows the Eibishter's ownership and mastery over the individual person. That the person was created for the purpose of serving his master. As a Yid, if a Yid is going to engage in worldly matters, it is possible that he will forget the purpose for which he was created. As there is an Eved Hashem, that he's a servant of Hashem, and his entire desire and his entire endeavor should be to cleave to Hashem. It's possible that the person's going to get too immersed in the worldly matters that he's working with, and he's going to forget the whole purpose. So Eibishter, after every 6 years, gives him a year. When a Yid has to remove himself from the worldly matters, and to devote himself entirely to spiritual pursuits. In where his connection to Hashem is very clear and obvious. And this gives the Yid the strength, that when it comes to the next 6 years, when he has to work the field, should be able to feel, as that even working the field is part of serving Hashem, to serve my master. Either he's doing it for the sake of heaven, or even more than that, but even in his material pursuits, there is the knowledge of Hashem, that he transforms the Gashmias to do it with a godly purpose. That's step number one. The Eibishter said during Shmita year that the person has to rest. Why? Because the Eibishter has to remind the person that the Eibishter is the Balabayis, is the master of this person, is the owner of the person, and this person was created to be an Eved Hashem. Shvisas Haaretz. The fact that the land has to rest is madgish the bailas from Eibishter after Eretz Koilel Irteva v'chut Keteva b'chlal. Emphasizes, highlights the ownership of Hashem on the earth and on nature in general. On the nature of the earth and on nature in general. If you're going to ask, what are we going to eat in the 7th year? If we're not going to plant a field, we're not going to gather the produce, what are we going to eat? Says the Eibishter, I will command my blessing in the 6th year, and it'll provide tevua, grain, for 3 years. Is the tzmichum wuchs von der Tvua tolli in dem Friede knacken sein. According to nature, the growth of the produce, of the grain, is dependent on previously plowing and sowing. So the Eibishter shows us in the year of Shmita, das was the Erd macht wachsen Tvua and Pedes, of the fact that the earth produces fruit and grain. It's not because of the power in the earth and the quality of the earth. When Alpiz is upbegging in Charishos Dia, which is why you need to plow and sow. The fact that the earth produces fruit or grain is because the Eibishter is giving it the koyach to grow. And if the Eibishter wants, the tvua could grow against the rules of nature. If when the Eibishter gets involved, he can go in a supernatural way, and that the grain, the seeds that were planted for a year, will last for 3 years. And from this, we draw recognition and acknowledgement that even in the 6 years when we are plowing and we are planting, as the tvuv vaks by him in Sades, that which ultimately grows is not because he plowed and planted. Coming from the bracha of Hashem. So the second element of Shmita is the fact that the earth has to rest, and this proves the bailus of Hashem on nature. That the Eibishter is in charge of nature, and even if nature says that certain things have to grow, and first has to be preceded by certain acts of plowing and planting, etc., the Eibishter says no, it doesn't have to be that way. Sifyut. Then you have the third element of Shmita, the fact that the fruits are hefker. This highlights the fact that the Eibishter is the owner of the person's possessions. Even after Hashem blessed the person with possessions, in the Eibishter's Bailas Rishus, they remain in the Eibishter's ownership. A person could think, hey, Nemes has no the Eibishter. It's true that the Eibishter is the one who gives the blessing. And the koyach of the tvua should grow. And it's not the fact that he planted and he plowed, or the fact that he has a good quality soil. But then, after the Eibishter gives him the bracha, now the tvua grew into whose field? His field. So he could say, see that? The Eibishter gave me the tvua into my own possession. It's true that a person knows he was created to serve Hashem, and therefore everything that the Eibishter gave him, he gave him as a tool with which to serve Hashem, either by using it for holy matters, or it could be material matters, but they're being done for the sake of heaven. A person could still feel, as the nechasim balaying in su'im, that the possessions belong to him, and he's the one who gets to choose how to use them according to the will of Hashem. That's a person could think, it's true, I'm going to do everything, I'm going to do the right things with it, but I'm the one who does the right things with it. I'm the one who gets to do the right things with it. Comes the third element of Shvius and teaches us as a Yid has no ownership and his own possessions. And this is expressed in the fact that once every 7 years the Torah commands as in felt that all the fruits that grew in his field, and everyone could take it. Does their mond, this reminds the person, as that in those 6 years, the other 6 years, when he's allowed to keep the fruits for himself, he says, it's not because they belong to him, so that he can do whatever he wants with it. But it's the Eibishter's possessions, which were given to him to hold on to, as Erzol Zayin, dem Eibishter Shliach, so durchführen mit das was der Eibishter will, that he should be the Eibishter Shliach to fulfill that which the Eibishter wants. So we have 3 parts to Shmita: the prohibition on the person, the prohibition on the earth, meaning to say the fact that the earth has to see that all work with the earth has to stop, and on the fruit. This teaches us that the Eibishter is the balabais on the person, and that person has to be an Eved Hashem, a servant of Hashem. This shows that the Eibishter is balabais on nature, and even when things go according to nature, it's because the Eibishter is blessing it, and it also shows that the Eibishter is balabais and our possessions, and even when we do get to keep the possessions, the Eibishter is giving it to us so that we should do the right thing with it, the thing that He would want us to do with it. And now, what we're going to do is create a bridge between Shemita and Hakhel. The theme of these three elements, the fact that the person is resting, the fact that the earth is resting, and the fact that the peiros are hefker, which express the ownership of Hashem, af and adam on the person, eretz v'chuki on the earth and on the nature, unichsev on the person's possessions, is the chelek ha'toichin from the parshas l'chamalent b'Hakhel. These three themes are going to be seen also in the parshas that are read at Hakhel. Parsha Shema, Vayim Shmeya, und Asat Asak is Chalal Aser. In Parsha Shema, that's sich wegen der Eved Ruchnis von Aiden. Parsha Shema talks about the person's spiritual Aveda. Kabbalah's Ilma Chashmaim to accept the yoke of heaven. Limud Ateret to learn Torah v'shinantam levanecha. Kiyim ha-mitzvahs, tefillin u'mezuzah, the fulfillment of mitzvahs. So Shema is all about the Yid's Aved Ruchnis. But das is behasen zum ersten Linien and Allen Shmita, Shvisas Adam, which this is consistent with the first element of Shmita, the fact that the person is resting. So during the Shmita year, he was not working, so that way he could have extra time for spiritual pursuits. Then comes the king at Hakhel, and so Shema Yisrael Hashem L'Kenesh L'Echad, reminding you to continue pursuing his spiritual avodah. In Parshas Vayim Shmeya, Retzich v'duch Shmeya Tishmu is v'nesatim taratz chabitoi. That when we listen to Hashem's mitzvahs, then Eivus will give rain in its time. V'yasafta d'genacha, you'll be able to gather your grain. When Eib Chas Shalom v'sartem, and if Chas Shalom you will stray from the Eibishter's ways, is v'lo yiyeh matar, v'adam alei sitin, there won't be rain, and the earth won't produce. Das is madgish, wie der Eibishter the balvais of Chukei HaTeva. This emphasizes that the Eibishter is in control of nature. When the Pharisee gasps von Aiden vasafte die Genacha, abhängig, nicht in Charishus Diya Shel Adam, nor in Shemaya Tishmo Mitzvah. And therefore the gasmis, the material success of the Yid, is dependent not so much on how much he plows and plants, but on following the Eibishter's mitzvahs. In Uisfolgen, the Eibishter's Ratzon, in fulfilling the will of Hashem. Und die Parshas Aser to Aser, ki sechalel Aser, seine Madgish wie die Nechasim von Aiden, seine bei ihm wie Apikoden von dem Eibishten, and the Parshas of Aser to Aser and ki sechalel Aser, which speak about the mitzvah of tithing. This emphasizes that the possessions of a Yid are given to a person for safekeeping, not for ownership. Und der Adam ist auf sein Nitkin Balabais, the person doesn't own them. Was das drückt sich aus in dem, was Hakhel ist in Nechasim, muss der weggeben an zweiten Eden. And this, which is expressed in the fact that some of his possessions he has to give away to another Yid, either Matnas Aniyim, either the gifts that were given to the poor, such as Tzedakah, or Leket Shikha and Peah, or Afrashas Trumas U'Maistis, as well as giving Trumas U'Maistis, which is also giving away some of his own possession. But Dugmit says, just like the fruits of Shviz, which anybody who needs them can take them. So the three elements that we experience in Shmita, we also see them in the Parshias that the king is reading during Hakhel, and thus inspiring the Yidden to keep on going in these three paths into the Hakhel year and into the 6 years that follow. Und der Pfarrer ist mit der Kriya of Parshat Melech. This also explains why we end with the mitzvah of with the parsha that speaks about appointing a king. Und echt die Kriya von alle Parshas an alles durch Melech, and all of the parshas are being read by the king. Because the true recognition that the person and the entire creation are not an independent entity. They're alles geherzt and everything belongs to Hashem. This knowledge, this recognition is accomplished by the king. Because the primary goal and role of the king is to influence and to draw down to Yidden and in Yidden the idea of Kabbalah's oil, the idea of Yiras Hashem, fear of Hashem, bisum hergish von emes and bittul, and to feel true bittul, was gitnet kenot from Metzias chutz von Eibishten, which does not allow any other existence to exist. So the overall theme of Shmita, which is the Bailus of Hashem, is emphasized besides in the three pratim and in the different parashas that are read, but also in the idea of the fact that the Melech is the one who reads them, and the fact that we read Parshas HaMelech. Das ist echt der Biur Pnimi. In Sif Yud Beis, the Rebbe is going to connect the end of Rashi, the fact that Shvius is still observed in the 8th year, and going to connect that as another connection between Shemita and Hakhel. Das ist der Biur Pnimi, was it didn't from Dain Shvius Neges Ba in Shana Shminis is Davke in dem Katsher Shal Shvius Yitzadam Tzoi Shvius. This is the explanation why the idea of Shvius being carried over into the 8th year, Rashi says it's about the harvesting of the things that grew in Shvius into the 8th year. And the Rebbe explains, the akar was benamed dadurch von Shvius Azaras, the Rebbe is balabais of Eretz v'chuki teva. The second element that we spoke about previously, the fact that in Shemita and the earth doesn't do any work, gives us the recognition that the Eibishter is the owner of the world and the ruler of nature. Is Saividon Shana Shminis that already exists in the 8th year. Because we're eating from the things that were planted in the 6th year. The pasuk says you're gonna plant in the 8th year, but you're still gonna eat the old grain until the 9th year, which means in the 8th year, what are you eating? You're eating from the 6th year. And therefore you see very clearly Hashem's beracha. Because according to nature, this can happen, and there's nothing's going to grow in the 8th year. The fact that things are still growing in the 8th year is miraculous. So the fact that the Eibishter is a balabayis and chukei ateva, a nature, that we know automatically by the fact that things are still growing in the 8th year. In the Shana Asmin good for the Akaras that Adam B'chol HaShalei Gehertz Meibishten. But in order that, in addition to knowing that the Eibishter is the balabais of the world, a person should know that the Eibishter is a balabais over him. For that, we have another aspect happening in the 8th year. That there's still the laws of Shemita with regards to harvesting. As that even the 8th year, the person is not the owner to be able to go and harvest, despite the fact that it's in his field. And therefore he recognizes that he belongs to Hashem. So in other words, also in the 8th year, we have two elements of the three above mentioned. Number one, in the order that the Rebbe says it here, that the Eibishter says balabais on nature, that we know because we're eating the stuff from the 6th year. And the fact that the Eibishter says balabais on the person, from the fact that the Eibishter prohibits him to harvest the things that started growing in Shvius. When we're in a time that you're feeling the same vibes as Shemita, both in the fact that you see that the Eibishter is still feeding the person. Also in the fact that the person feels that he's not his own mitzias. Because we're not allowing him to conduct himself in his field as if he's the owner. He's demoed. Now, when not only during the Shemita year, but even after the Shemita year, where we're feeling the same feelings as Shemita, is devil the pasuk at sight as the kedis a parsha of Hakhel durch Melech. So laben apnimis dik in virukung aktivate dik sheshanim is the most appropriate time that to read the parshas of Hakhel by the king should have a deep inner impact on the next 6 years. Biz as velamdu liyidas Hashem alekecha kol hayamim asher atem chayim ala adama, until we will learn to fear Hashem all the days that we are alive on the face of this earth.